Steam rises off green water in the heart of an English city. It rose yesterday. It rose when Rome ruled here. And the water itself, scientists estimate, may have fallen as rain thousands of years before that. The Romans built a temple around this spring and called it sacred. The Georgians built a golden city around it. The same golden streets you have seen standing in for Regency London in Bridgerton. Jane Austen walked these pavements, quietly resented the world they created, then turned that world into some of the greatest novels in the English language. This is Bath, a city bombed for its beauty, a city that nearly demolished itself. Twice, a city where you can still bathe in hot water rising from the same spring that drew ancient worshippers before Rome had ever heard of Britain. So here is the question this story will answer. How does one small spring keep reinventing an entire city for 2,000 years? This is the entire history of Bath, and it begins long before the Romans came. Chapter 1. The Sacred Spring. Every city in this series exists for a reason. Paris had its river island. Boston had its harbour. Hiroshima had its delta. Bath has something stranger than any of them. Bath exists because the earth itself is broken here. And out of that break comes a miracle. Stand in the green hills of southwest England and you are standing in a cold, wet, grey country. Rain arrives sideways off the Atlantic. Rivers run cold enough to numb your hands in summer. And yet in one small valley, on the banks of a river called the Avon, hot water pours out of the ground. Not warm water, hot water, around 115 degrees Fahrenheit. Day and night, summer and winter. More than 1 million litres of it every single day. As far as any record shows, it has never once stopped. To understand why, you have to follow a single drop of rain. And the journey of that drop is so strange that it sounds like myth. Geologists who have studied the springs, including researchers working with the Roman Baths Museum and the British Geological Survey, believe the story goes something like this. Rain falls on the Mendip Hills, a range of limestone high ground miles to the south of Bath. The water sinks into the stone and keeps sinking, down through cracks and channels, thousands of feet below the surface, where the rock holds the deep heat of the earth. There, the water warms, absorbs minerals, and then finds a fault, a fracture in the rock layers. That gives it a path back up. It rises fast enough that it cannot cool down, and it breaks the surface in the valley of the Avon at 3 points, all within a few hundred yards of each other. Now here is the detail that should stop you for a moment. The scientists studying this system estimate that the water rising in Bath today fell as rain thousands of years ago, and some published estimates stretch that journey toward 10,000 years. The numbers are estimates, and specialists debate them, but the scale is not in doubt. The water is old beyond imagining, which means that when you look at that green pool, you are not just looking at old stone. You may be looking at rain that fell before farming reached this island. Remember that. In this story, everything else will change. Empires will rise and rot. Buildings will burn and be rebuilt. The water will simply keep arriving. And every age of this city will be an answer to the same question. What do we do with the miracle? The first people to answer that question left no writing, so we have to read their answer in objects. Archaeologists excavating around the springs have found flint tools left by hunter-gatherers thousands of years before farming reached Britain. Picture what those people saw. A clearing in the forest where the ground steamed. Pools of orange-stained water, coloured by iron minerals, bubbling up through the mud. Birds gathering in winter because the ground never froze. In a cold country, this was the one place where the earth breathed warmth. And it is hard to imagine anyone standing there and concluding it was ordinary. By the time we reach the centuries just before the Romans arrived, the people living in this region were Britons, speaking a Celtic language, organized into tribal groupings. The tribe associated with this area is known to history as the Dobuni, and we know something remarkable about how they treated the spring, because of what they threw into it. Excavations of the sacred spring. Most famously, the work led by the archaeologist Barry Cunliffe in the 1970s and 1980s. Recovered coins from the Iron Age, dropped into the water before Rome ever ruled here. Somebody stood at the edge of that steaming pool more than 2,000 years ago, took out a piece of money, and gave it to the water. Hold on to that coin. You do not give your wealth to plumbing. You give it to a god. And at the very end of this story, in the 2020s, we are going to watch someone do exactly the same thing. The Britons had a name for the power in the water. They called her Sulis. We know almost nothing about her directly, because her worshippers did not write. But her name survived, and that survival is itself the evidence. When the Romans arrived, with all their power and all their arrogance, they did not erase Sulis. They kept her name and simply attached their own goddess to it. That tells you the local goddess was too established, too respected, and perhaps too feared to replace. Hold on to Sulis. She is about to get the grandest temple in Britain. There is one more story from these early centuries. And this is where we have to be honest with you about the difference between history and legend. Medieval writers, centuries later, told of a British king named Bladud, who supposedly lived long before the Romans. The legend says Bladud contracted leprosy, was cast out of his father's court, and worked as a swineherd. His pigs, the story goes, waded into the steaming mud of the springs and were cured of a skin disease. And when Bladud followed them into the mud, he was cured too, and returned to become king, and founded a settlement at the springs in gratitude. It is a wonderful story. There is no historical evidence that Bladud existed. The tale first appears in writing more than 1,000 years after the events it claims to describe. But notice what the legend is really saying, because the people who invented it understood this place perfectly. It is a story about the water healing what nothing else could heal. That idea, true or not in the case of Bladud, is the engine of this entire city. For the next 2,000 years, everything Bath becomes. The Roman shrine, the medieval hospital town, the Georgian pleasure capital, even the modern spa, will be built on that single promise. The water can fix you, so picture the valley one last time as the old world ends. A sacred pool in a clearing, tended by Britons, guarded by a goddess named Sulis, glittering with offered coins under the orange-stained water. To the east, across the sea, a rumour is moving. In the year 43 AD, the legions of the Emperor Claudius land on the coast of Britain, and the most organised empire the ancient world has ever produced begins marching west. When those soldiers finally reach this valley, cold, far from home, in a province they will complain about for 4 centuries, they will find hot water rising out of British soil. And a Roman, of all people, knows exactly what hot water is worth. Chapter 2. Aquae Sulis. The Romans reached this valley within a generation of their invasion, and what they built here over the next 3 centuries was not a normal town. To understand how unusual it was, you need one comparison. Most Roman towns in Britain were named for tribes or fortresses. This one was named for a goddess. The Romans called it Aquae Sulis, the waters of Sulis, and that name is the first clue that this place was never meant to be ordinary. It was meant to be a destination. The transformation began, as far as archaeologists can tell, in the decades after 60 AD, And think about what the engineering actually required. Because it is easy to say the Romans built baths and miss the audacity of it. The sacred spring was not a tidy fountain. It was a churning pool of hot water rising through mud at the bottom of a valley that flooded. Roman engineers drove oak piles into that mud, sealed the spring inside a reservoir lined with sheets of lead, and captured the flow so completely that they could send it wherever they wanted. That lead lining still holds water today, nearly 2,000 years after it was laid down. There are modern cities that cannot keep a water main working for 50 years. The Roman plumbing of Bath has been working for almost 2,000. Around that captured spring, they raised 2 buildings that turned a tribal shrine into an international sanctuary. The first was a temple to the goddess, built in the classical style, with fluted columns and a carved pediment, one of only a handful of truly classical temples known from Roman Britain. And the goddess they honored there tells you everything about how Rome actually ruled. She was not simply the Roman goddess Minerva, installed over the conquered shrine. She was Sulis Minerva, the local goddess and the Roman goddess fused into one name. Her gilded bronze head was found by workmen digging a sewer in 1727, and it is displayed in the Roman Baths Museum today. One of the most striking objects ever recovered from Roman Britain. Look at that face, and you are looking at a compromise between 2 civilizations. Cast in bronze, the second building was the bathing complex itself, and at its heart was the Great Bath, a pool longer than a modern tennis court, lined with 45 sheets of Roman lead, fed directly by the sacred hot water, and originally covered by an enormous, vaulted hall. Around it spread heated rooms, cold plunges, and steam rooms running on underfloor heating. The hollow floor system the Romans called a hypocaust, where slaves fed furnaces so that hot air circulated beneath the very tiles bathers walked on. Now come down from the architecture and spend an afternoon there, because the daily life of this place is where it comes alive. A Roman bath was not a quick wash. It was the gym, the spa, the social club, and the business district rolled into one. And the routine had a rhythm every Roman knew. You undressed in a changing room and left your clothes with an attendant, or with a slave if you had one. And if you had neither, you kept one nervous eye on your belongings, for reasons that will make you laugh in a moment. You exercised, perhaps with weights, perhaps wrestling. You moved through progressively hotter rooms until you sweated freely. And instead of soap, you rubbed scented oil into your skin and scraped it off, sweat and dirt together, with a curved bronze blade called a strigil. Archaeologists have found these strigils, along with hairpins, gaming counters, and gemstones shaken loose from rings in the warm water. An entire lost afternoon of the 2nd century sitting in museum cases today. Then came the plunge pools, hot to cold, and finally, the long soak in the Great Bath itself, where the steam rose into the vaulted roof and the talk, we can be confident, was of money, politics, lawsuits, and other people's marriages. For a Briton of the 1st century, walking out of a landscape of thatched roundhouses into that echoing, marble-clad hall must have been like stepping onto another planet. That was the point. The building was an argument. It said, "This is what Rome can do with your miracle." And people came. This is what separates Aquae Sulis from an ordinary provincial town. Tombstones and altars found in and around Bath record visitors and residents from across the empire. There is a memorial to a woman from the city of Trier. In what is now Germany, there is a stone set up by a man from northern Gaul. There are soldiers from Spanish regiments, and a stonemason from the region of Chartres in modern France. Some came to be healed. Some came to work the pilgrim trade, and some came to die trying, because tombstones of the sick who did not recover are part of the record too. nearly 2,000 years before anyone coined the word tourism. This small valley in Britain was living on visitors. Hold that thought, because it is the business model this city will run, in one form or another, for the rest of this story. But the most extraordinary evidence from Roman Bath is not the architecture. It is the voices. Visitors threw offerings into the sacred spring, exactly as the Britons had thrown their coins before them. And when Barry Cunliffe's team excavated the spring in the 1970s and 1980s, they recovered more than 12,000 coins, jewelry, silver vessels, and around 130 small sheets of lead and pewter with messages scratched into them. Scholars call them the curse tablets, and they are among the most human documents to survive from the entire Roman world. They are now recognized by UNESCO's Memory of the World program in the United Kingdom, because here is what people actually wrote to the goddess. They did not write poetry. They wrote complaints. Somebody stole my cloak. Somebody stole my gloves. Somebody took coins from my purse while I was in the bath. The victims ask Sulis Minerva to punish the thief, sometimes with alarming creativity, asking that the guilty party lose sleep or health until the stolen goods are returned to her temple. One tablet lists suspects by name. Another carefully covers every possibility, asking the goddess to pursue the thief, whether man or woman, slave or free, boy or girl. Read those lines, and the ancient world stops being marble statues and becomes a locker room with a theft problem. These were ordinary people, undressing to enter the water, discovering their belongings gone, and doing the first-century equivalent of filing a police report, addressed to heaven. And notice what the tablets prove. People believed the goddess of this spring was real, present, and paying attention. The Roman genius was not that they replaced that belief. It is that they organized it, wrapped it in marble, and marketed it across an empire. If that sounds cynical, wait until you meet the Georgians. For roughly 3 centuries, the arrangement worked. The temple precinct was rebuilt and elaborated. The baths were expanded. A town grew up around the sanctuary, with inns and shops and workshops serving the pilgrim traffic. Aquae Sulis was never large. Perhaps a few thousand permanent residents by most archaeological estimates, but it was famous. And in the ancient world, as in ours, fame and size are different things. Then, slowly, the world that sustained it began to fail. By the late 300s, the Roman Empire in the West was under pressure everywhere, from invasions, from civil wars, from economic decay. Britain was a frontier province, expensive to defend and far from the center. Archaeologists studying the baths have found evidence that in these late years, the trouble reached even here. Flooding grew worse as the drainage systems that demanded constant maintenance stopped getting it. Mud began creeping into the lower chambers. Repairs became patches. And then the patches stopped in 410 AD. According to the traditional account, the Emperor Honorius told the cities of Britain that Rome could no longer defend them, and they must look to their own defenses. Whether or not that letter meant exactly what tradition says, the reality on the ground was clear. The legions were gone. The coin economy collapsed within a generation, and a temple spa town had a problem no curse tablet could solve. Aquae Sulis was a machine for turning visitors into wealth, and the roads that carried the visitors were no longer safe. The lead-line spring did not care. The hot water kept rising, 1 million liters a day, into a sanctuary where the staff had stopped coming to work. The mud kept rising with it. How long does it take for a civilization to be completely forgotten? In Bath, we can measure the answer almost exactly. It takes about 300 years. And 1 poem. Chapter 3. The Dark Water. What happens to a sacred place when the civilization that built it walks away? In Bath, we do not have to imagine the answer. We can read it, because someone stood in the ruins and wrote a poem about them. But first, watch the city fall apart in slow motion. There was no sack of Aquae Sulis, no burning day for archaeologists to find in an ash layer. There was something quieter, and in its own way, more frightening. The drains clogged. The hot springs, no longer channeled, turned the low ground back into steaming marsh. The great vaulted roof over the bath, an engineering marvel requiring exactly the kind of skilled maintenance that no longer existed in Britain, weakened over the decades until it came down into the pool it had sheltered. Silt and rubble buried the great bath so completely that its very existence would be forgotten for more than 1,000 years. Generations of people would live their entire lives in Bath, directly on top of the finest Roman bathing complex in northern Europe, and never know it was under their feet. The temple of Sulis Minerva collapsed in stages, and pieces of its carved pediment ended up laid face down, used as simple paving slabs. The face of the goddess spent centuries being walked on by people who had no idea she was there. These are the centuries traditionally called the Dark Ages, and historians rightly warn that the name is unfair to a complicated period. But standing in Bath, some darkness is simply factual. Literacy collapsed. Stone construction stopped. The population of the old town shrank to a fraction of its Roman peak, and into this landscape came new settlers from across the North Sea, the Angles and Saxons, whose descendants would call themselves the English. Here, the record gives us two glimpses, one legendary and one literary. And following our rule, we will be honest about which is which. The legendary glimpse is a battle. Early medieval sources describe a great victory by the native Britons over the advancing Saxons at a place called Mount Badon, fought sometime around 500 AD. Centuries later, writers attach that victory to a war leader whose name you know, Arthur. Some historians have suggested Badon may have been fought in the hills near Bath, and the 9th century writer Nennius is among the early sources connecting Arthur to the battle. But we owe you the truth. No one knows where Badon was fought. No contemporary source names Arthur at all. The earliest accounts of the battle do not mention him. Arthur, as we know him, is a legend built up over centuries, and Bath's claim to him is possibility, not proof. What the battle does tell us, wherever it happened, is that this region was frontier country, contested ground between two peoples. For well over a century, the literary glimpse is something better than legend. Sometime in the 700s or 800s, an Anglo-Saxon poet stood among Roman ruins and wrote about what he saw. The poem survives in a manuscript called the Exeter Book, and scholars know it as the Ruin. Many specialists believe the ruins it describes are Bath, because the poet marvels at something almost no other Roman site in Britain could show him. Hot streams, bathhouses, stone courts where the water welled up with heat at its heart. The poet describes shattered towers and fallen gates, the work of giants decaying, and imagines the vanished people who once walked there, bright with gold, flushed with wine, shining in war gear. His own people could not build in stone like this. To him, the broken walls of Bath were evidence of a race of giants, and the poem is soaked in a feeling the Anglo-Saxons knew well, a grief for glory that has passed. Think about what that means. Bath is perhaps the only city in this series that became a legend twice, once while it worked, and once as a ruin. Yet the Saxons did not abandon the site, and the reason will not surprise you. The water, the springs kept flowing through every century of chaos, and by the 700s a monastery stood at Bath. Founded, according to surviving charters, in 675, around the abbey, a small market town revived inside the crumbling Roman walls. The English called the place by names that all meant the same thing. The baths. Whatever else was forgotten. The one unforgettable fact remained in the town's very name. And then, near the end of this period, forgotten Little Bath suddenly hosted one of the most important ceremonies in English history. In 973, King Edgar was crowned at Bath Abbey in a ritual designed by Dunstan, the Archbishop of Canterbury. Edgar had already ruled for years. This was something more than a coronation. It was a statement, a carefully staged service, proclaiming a single anointed king over a unified English realm. And the service created for Edgar at Bath became the model on which English coronations have been based ever since. Elements of that ceremony, more than 1,000 years old, were present in the coronation of King Charles III in 2023. Why Bath? Historians have long noted the obvious symbolism. Bath had ruins that whispered of Rome, of empire, of ancient legitimate power. Edgar's advisors, wanting to crown not just a king, but an idea, chose the one stage in England where the scenery itself made the argument. There is a strange poetry in that choice. The city could no longer heat a single bath, but its broken stones could still crown a king, even as a Rhine. Bath was performing, projecting an image of itself grander than its reality. Remember this trick. This city will use it again and again. For now, hold a single image. It is a winter morning, around the year 1000. A monk crosses the abbey yard through the cold, and off to his left, beyond a wall, steam is rising from waste ground, where the hot water still bubbles up through weeds and Roman rubble. He does not know what lies under the mud. Nobody alive knows. The greatest treasure in the town is invisible, waiting, and it will wait another 800 years. Chapter 4. Wool and Miracles. In 1066, England changed owners. William of Normandy took the crown at Hastings, and within a generation, his followers held every important office in the land. For most English towns, the Norman conquest is a story about castles. For Bath, it is a story about a shopping transaction. Because in 1090, something happened to this city that almost never happened in medieval Europe. Bath was sold. A Norman royal physician and churchman named John of Tours purchased the city from the crown. And he did it for a reason that tells you the springs were still the whole story. John moved the seat of his bishopric from the nearby town of Wells to Bath, began rebuilding the abbey church on an enormous scale, and, according to the 12th century historian William of Malmesbury, took a personal interest in the baths themselves. Notice who this man was. A physician. Of all the Normans who could have bought Bath, the one who did was a doctor. And under his rule the springs were rebuilt, not as a temple this time, but as something closer to a hospital. 3 main baths served the town through the medieval centuries, and the sick came to soak in them under the supervision of the church. Around 1174, a hospital was founded near the hot baths, St. John's Hospital, to house the poor who came seeking cures. That institution still exists in Bath today. More than 800 years later, one of the oldest charities in England. See what has happened here. The Romans answered the question of the miracle with a goddess. The medieval English answered it with mercy. Same water, same steam, same promise that the water can fix you. But the management had completely changed. Sulis Minerva was gone. The healing now belonged to God. The profits belonged to the church. And the customers were no longer empire-spanning tourists, but the sick poor of England, arriving on foot. So come down into the street and look at this town, because medieval Bath is the version of the city almost nobody imagines. And it deserves one honest walk through. It is market day, sometime in the 1300s. The town is small, packed inside its old Roman wall. And it smells of wood smoke, of animals, of the sulphur tang of the springs, and above all, of wool. Because wool is what this town does now. Down by the river, the fulling mills thump as water wheels drive wooden hammers that pound the cloth. Dyers' hands are stained blue to the elbow. In the market, fleeces from the sheep hills around the town are weighed and argued over, because English wool in these centuries is the finest in Europe, the oil of its age, the commodity that finances kings. If you want a measure of how central wool was to medieval England, consider that to this day, the presiding officer in the House of Lords traditionally sits on a woolsack, a cushion stuffed with wool, placed there centuries ago as a reminder of where the nation's wealth came from. And threading through the market crowd, you see them. The reason the town's second economy never dies. The sick, pilgrims on crutches, lepers ringing warning bells, the desperate of half of England, limping toward the steaming baths and the hospital by the gate, because everyone has heard that the water can fix you. It is in exactly this cloth trade bath that the city makes its first great entrance into English literature. In the 1380s and 1390s, a London customs official named Geoffrey Chaucer was writing the Canterbury Tales, a collection of stories told by pilgrims riding to the shrine at Canterbury. Among his pilgrims is a clothmaker, a much-married, gap-toothed, loud, brilliant woman that Chaucer calls the wife of Bath. He tells us her cloth-making surpassed the famous weavers of Ypres and Ghent, which was a joke with teeth, because those Flemish cities were the acknowledged masters of the trade. And he gives her one of the most astonishing voices in medieval literature. She has buried 5 husbands. She quotes scripture to defend her love life. She argues, 600 years before the word existed, about who holds power inside a marriage. Stop and appreciate what Chaucer did, because it matters to this whole story. He needed a character who was commercially sharp, socially confident, and impossible to ignore, and the hometown he chose for her was Bath. Already, in the 1300s, this city's name carried a flavour, something worldly, prosperous, a little pleasure-loving. The wife of Bath is fiction, and we should say plainly that she is not evidence of any real woman's life, but she is evidence of a reputation. And here is the connection that Jane Austen's readers should hold on to. More than 400 years before Austen wrote a word, the first unforgettable woman in English literature already carried Bath in her name. This city and the English novel are going to keep meeting. It starts here. Meanwhile, the Abbey, the city's other pillar, was living through a slow humiliation. The bishops eventually moved their main seat back to Wells, and the huge Norman church of John of Tours, too big for the shrinking community that had to maintain it, fell gradually into decay. By the late 1400s, a visiting bishop named Oliver King found the great church in ruins. According to a tradition recorded in Bath, King experienced a dream of angels ascending and descending a ladder to heaven, and heard words urging a king to restore the church. Whether or not the dream happened as told, and we cannot verify a 15th century dream, what is certain is what he did. Around 1499, Oliver King began demolishing the vast ruin and raising in its place a smaller, breathtaking church in the final flowering of English Gothic style, with fan-vaulted ceilings like stone lace, and on the west front, carvers cut his dream into the facade itself. Ladders of angels climbing the towers. You can stand in front of Bath Abbey today and see them still. Some of the angels famously carved head first, as if diving down the ladder toward the city. It was the last great act of Catholic Bath. The Abbey church was barely finished when the world that built it was destroyed, not by invasion, not by decay, but by a king's signature. In the 1530s, Henry VIII broke with Rome, declared himself head of the English Church, and began dissolving the monasteries of England, seizing their lands and wealth for the crown. In 1539, Bath Priory surrendered to the king's officers. The monks were pensioned off and scattered. The monastic buildings were stripped, the lead pulled from roofs, and the community that had tended the sick at the springs for centuries was erased in an afternoon of paperwork. 400 years of management, gone with a signature. The great church stood windowless. The sick still came, because the sick always come. And the town was left holding the miracle and a question it had not faced since the legions left. Who does the water work for now? Chapter 5. The Queen's Cure. Every resurrection of Bath begins with someone important getting into the water. In the 1500s, with the monks gone, and the abbey a shell, the city needed a new story to tell about its springs. And it found one in the new learning of the age. English physicians began writing books about the medicinal virtues of mineral waters. And Bath, with the only hot springs in the country, was their prize exhibit. The physician William Turner published work in the 1560s promoting the healing power of Bath's waters. And a doctor named John Jones followed with a treatise called The Baths of Bath's Aid in 1572. The pitch had been translated once again. The goddess was gone. The saints were gone. And in their place stood the doctor. The water can fix you. But now it said so, with a prescription. The city rebuilt its pitch just in time, because the customers who arrived next were the most valuable in England. In 1574, Queen Elizabeth I visited Bath. Royal attention brought money for restoring the abbey and, more valuable than money, it brought fashion. Where a queen went, courtiers followed. And where courtiers went, everyone who wished to be near power followed them. Through the early 1600s, a trickle of aristocratic visitors became a steady stream. Anne of Denmark, queen to James I, came to bathe for her health, and one of the baths was afterward associated with her name. Bath in this era was still small, smelly, and medieval in its bones, with bathers of all sorts crowded into the open pools, while spectators watched from the railings above, and visitors complained in writing about the crudeness of it all. But the pattern that would define the city's future was locked in place. Bath was becoming the place where the powerful went to repair their bodies, and increasingly, to be seen repairing them. Then, in the 1680s, the springs of Bath were dragged into the highest politics in the land. This is a story most visitors to Bath have never heard, even though it helped redirect the history of the English-speaking world. And if you are watching in America, it runs closer to your founding documents than you might guess. The King of England was James II, and he had a problem that was also his country's problem. James was Catholic, ruling a Protestant nation that tolerated him for one reason above all. He was aging, and his heirs, his two adult daughters, Mary and Anne, were safely Protestant. His Catholic queen, Maria of Modena, had suffered years of pregnancies that ended in miscarriage or in children who died young. And by the mid-1680s, the royal couple had no surviving child. To England's Protestant establishment, this was not a tragedy. It was a comfort. They could endure a Catholic king because his crown would pass to Protestant daughters. The whole uneasy peace of the kingdom rested on an empty royal cradle. In the summer of 1687, on medical advice, Queen Maria travelled to Bath and bathed in the waters known as the Cross Bath, seeking a cure for her childlessness. The king joined her during the visit, and within roughly a year of that visit to the springs, In June of 1688, the Queen gave birth to a healthy son, James Francis Edward Stuart, a Catholic Prince of Wales, a Catholic future, suddenly stretching ahead of Protestant England forever. Now, let us be careful, as our rule requires. No historian can tell you that the waters of Bath caused that pregnancy, and we will not tell you that either. What we can tell you is what people at the time believed and did, because that is documented. Catholics celebrated the birth as an answer to prayer, and a monument of thanksgiving was later erected in the cross bath itself to commemorate the Queen's cure. Protestants, facing the collapse of their political hopes, reached for a darker explanation. Rumors spread that the pregnancy was fake and that a baby had been smuggled into the birth chamber in a warming pan. A story pushed so hard that the government later took formal depositions from dozens of witnesses to the birth. The warming pan story was false. The baby was real, and that was precisely the problem. Within months of the birth, a group of English notables sent an invitation to the Protestant Dutch ruler William of Orange, husband of the king's daughter Mary, asking him to intervene in England. In November of 1688, William landed with an army in the southwest of England, and his march toward London passed through this very region. James's support dissolved. The king fled to France with his wife and infant son, and Parliament declared the throne passed to William and Mary. The English call it the Glorious Revolution, and its consequences run straight into American history, because the Bill of Rights that Parliament extracted in 1689, limiting the crown and protecting subjects, became one of the documents the American founders knew intimately when they wrote their own a century later. Follow the chain backward and it is almost absurd. A constitutional revolution, triggered by the birth of a son, sought at a hot spring in Somerset. We are not claiming Bath's water made the revolution, and the revolution had causes far larger than one baby. But it is a matter of record that the desperate last hope of England's last Catholic queen was this city's oldest promise. The water can fix you. She believed it. Her enemies feared she was right, and the son, born after her cure, would spend his whole life as the pretender across the water, the ghost at the feast of British politics for half a century. For Bath itself, the affair had a quieter consequence, and it points straight at our next chapter. Royal visits, scandalous or not, kept the city in the newspapers and kept the fashionable world flowing through its cramped medieval streets. Queen Anne, the Protestant daughter who gained a throne from her half-brother's birth, herself visited Bath to take the waters in 1702 and 1703, setting off yet another rush of aristocratic imitation. The demand was now enormous. The city receiving that demand was still tiny, muddy, and medieval, a walled town of a few thousand people with almost nowhere decent to stay. Into that overcrowded little spa, in the first years of the 1700s, stepped a 20-something professional gambler with no money, no title, and no obvious qualifications for anything at all. His name was Richard Nash. History remembers him as Beau Nash, and the question of what one unemployed gambler could possibly do with a city is the entire subject of the next chapter. Because the answer turns out to be, he could invent modern celebrity resort culture, more or less single-handedly. Chapter 6. Beau Nash and the Invention of Polite Society. Here is a puzzle worth sitting with for a moment. In 1700, Bath was a cramped medieval town of perhaps 3,000 people, with muddy streets, rough lodgings, and public baths that visitors described with open disgust. By 1770, it was the most fashionable resort in the British world, a city of elegant stone where dukes waited their turn to dance. No war did that. No gold rush did that. Three men did it: a gambler, a businessman, and an architect obsessed with ancient Rome. This chapter is about the gambler. Richard Nash arrived in Bath around 1705, and nothing in his record suggested greatness. He was the son of a Welsh glass merchant. He had drifted through Oxford without a degree, through the army without distinction, and through the law courts of London without practicing much law. What he had was charm, nerve, a magnificent wardrobe he could barely afford, and a professional gambler's understanding of one deep truth: people will follow rules if the rules make them feel important. Bath, at that moment, was acquiring a social organizer, a master of ceremonies who ran the public entertainments. When the post fell vacant, Nash took the role, and over the following decades, he turned a courtesy title into something like a throne. Contemporaries and later writers called him the King of Bath, and only half of them were joking. The essayist Oliver Goldsmith, who published a biography of Nash in 1762, the year after Nash died, is one of our main sources for what happened next. And Goldsmith understood that his subject had done something genuinely new. Nash had realized that pleasure, of all things, could be governed. Consider what a visitor to early Bath actually faced. England's social order was rigid and prickly. Aristocrats brought their private feuds to town. Country gentlemen wore riding boots into ballrooms and did not care who objected. Gentlemen wore swords, and quarrels over cards or precedence could end at dawn with somebody bleeding in a meadow. A resort where all these people crowded together was one insult away from chaos at any moment. Nash's insight was that a resort could only function as a shared stage, and a shared stage needs a script. So he wrote 1. Nash established rules for the company at Bath, and the remarkable thing is that they were aimed upward as much as downward. Balls began at 6 and, famously, ended at 11, and tradition holds that Nash enforced the curfew even on royalty, on the grounds that dancing all night ruined health and looks alike. Goldsmith records the story of Nash halting the music at 11 despite the pleas of a princess. And while we cannot verify every detail of an anecdote like that, the rule itself and its strict enforcement are well documented. Nash campaigned against the wearing of swords in the city, a change credited with making dueling in Bath rare. He shamed gentlemen out of appearing at assemblies in boots, and he mocked ladies' white aprons, then a mark of informality, until the fashion surrendered. He organized the sequence of dances, the introductions between strangers, the etiquette of the pump room where visitors gathered each morning to drink the waters. Read that list again and notice what it amounts to. Nash was building a neutral zone, a place where a duchess and a merchant's wealthy daughter could occupy the same room under the same rules. Historians of the period describe 18th century Bath as one of the great engines of what the age itself called politeness, a new code of easy, regulated social mixing. And the reason it matters to our larger story is this: that regulated mixing is exactly the world Jane Austen's novels will dissect a century later. The assembly rooms where strangers are introduced, the public walks where reputations are made and lost, the marriage market operating politely over tea. Nash did not just tidy up a spa town. He helped design the social machinery that English literature would spend 100 years examining. When we finally meet Austen in this story, remember that the world she wrote about was, to a striking degree, an invention. And the inventor was a Welsh gambler with a white hat. And a gambler he remained. Understand where the money in this system came from. Because the elegance had an engine, and the engine was the gaming table. Nash lived, by most accounts, substantially on arrangements with the keepers of the gaming tables that flourished around the assemblies. The waters brought the sick, the season brought the fashionable, and the tables quietly collected from both. To his credit, Nash also policed the game, warning newcomers against known cheats and, in stories Goldsmith preserves, occasionally protecting young fools from ruinous play. But when Parliament passed laws in the 1740s suppressing the fashionable games of chance, Nash's income withered with them. The King of Bath lived his last years in genteel poverty, kept afloat in the end by a small pension from the very city he had made rich. He died in 1761, in his mid-80s, and Bath gave him a funeral of civic splendor. It was a fitting exit. The city he invented has never once been embarrassed to profit from a performance. While Nash was writing the social script, the second of our three men was quietly buying the scenery. Ralph Allen was a postal clerk from Cornwall who came to Bath young, spotted the inefficiencies in England's postal routes, and made a fortune reorganizing them under government contract. Then he made a second, larger bet. In the 1720s, he began acquiring the stone quarries on the hills just outside the city. At Combe Down, the stone under those hills is a honey-coloured limestone, soft enough to cut easily when freshly quarried, hardening as it weathers, and glowing gold in low sunlight. Allen built a railway of wooden rails, one of the earliest in England, to bring the stone down the hill. And he set out to prove to the country that Bath stone could face the grandest buildings in the land. His own house, Prior Park, a Palladian mansion overlooking the city, was built partly as an advertisement, a showroom you could live in. So by the 1720s, the stage manager was in place, and the building material was waiting in the hills. What Bath still lacked was a vision, some idea of what all this new stone should become. That arrived with the third man, and his idea was, on its face, close to madness. A young local architect named John Wood looked at this small English spa and decided it should be rebuilt as Rome. Wood was born around 1704, and he grew up in a Bath that was still turning up fragments of its ancient past under its cellars. He became convinced that the city's destiny was written in its ruins, and he dreamed in the grandest classical vocabulary: forums, circuses, colonnade, where others saw a market town with a drainage problem. Wood saw the second coming of Aquae Sulis. Close this chapter with the image that matters. It is a season evening in the 1750s. In the ballroom, the fiddles stop at 11 exactly, because the King of Bath insists. The company files out into streets where new stone facades are rising. Pale gold, even by lantern light. A goddess once ruled this valley. Then the church. Then the physicians. Now, for the first time, the miracle has a master of ceremonies. The water can still fix you. People believed, but Nash's Bath added a second promise. 1. The modern world has never stopped buying. Come here, follow the rules, and you can become someone slightly better than the person you were at home. Chapter 7. Building the Golden City. Architecture is autobiography. A city builds what it believes about itself. And in the middle of the 1700s, Bath began telling the world, in golden stone, exactly what it believed. It believed it was Rome reborn. John Wood, the architect we met at the close of the last chapter, was the author of that belief. Wood was not just designing buildings. He was writing a story, and he told parts of it in an actual book, an eccentric work on the origins of Bath, in which he wove together the Bladud legend, Druids, and biblical history into a founding myth for his city. Scholars treat that book as fantasy, and so should we. But the fantasy had consequences you can walk through today, because Wood set out to give Bath the monumental forms of the ancient world. Forum, an imperial gymnasium, a circus like the great arenas of Rome. His method was as interesting as his vision. And it explains something you notice the moment you see Bath. The city looks like it was built by one hand. And it was not. Wood and the developers who followed him worked on a speculative system. The architect designed a unified facade, one great palace front, and then individual builders bought plots behind it and built houses of varying depths and layouts. The result is a magnificent stone mask with ordinary domestic life improvising behind it. Grandeur out front, compromise in back. If you wanted a single image for Georgian society, you could do worse. Wood's masterpiece came late in his life. In 1754, he laid the foundation stone of the circus, a perfect circle of 33 houses in 3 curved segments, its 3 tiers of paired columns rising in the classical orders. Doric, then Ionic, then Corinthian, the same ascending sequence used on the Colosseum in Rome. Carved acorns line the parapet, a nod to the Bladud legend Wood loved. He died months after construction began, and his son, also named John Wood, completed the work. The historian of architecture can tell you the circus inverts the Colosseum, turning the arena inside out so the columns face inward on a private lawn. The social historian will tell you something sharper. Rome built its circus for spectacle the public could watch. Bath built its circus for residents who were themselves the spectacle. The younger Wood then surpassed his father. Between 1767 and 1775, he built the Royal Crescent. 30 houses behind a single sweeping curve of 114 Ionic columns, facing open lawn with nothing to interrupt the view. It is often described as the finest crescent in Europe, and it created a form, the Great Residential Crescent, that cities from Edinburgh to London would imitate for a century. If its curve looks familiar to you, it should. This is the facade that stands in for the grandest addresses of Regency London every time a film crew comes to town. And film crews come constantly. The names of the streets tell you who all this was for. Royal Crescent, the Circus, Gay Street, Queen Square. This was not housing. This was scenery for a season. Terraces built so that the people inside could feel, for a few rented months, like the emperors of their own lives. And the boom kept building. In 1774, the architect Robert Adam completed Pulteney Bridge across the Avon, one of the very few bridges in the world lined with shops on both sides, built to open the far bank for a whole new district of speculation. The city's population roughly kept pace with its ambition. Bath grew from a few thousand people around 1700 to something on the order of 30,000 or more by the century's end, making it one of the larger cities in England. An astonishing trajectory for a town with no port, no major industry, and no product except well-being and status. Now we owe you the other half of the ledger. Because our rule in this series is that beauty does not get to hide its receipts. Begin with the crash. The building of Bath was a speculative frenzy, and speculation has weather. In 1793, war with revolutionary France triggered a financial panic across England. Credit froze, and Bath's building boom stopped almost mid-wall. Banks in the city failed. Builders went bankrupt by the dozen, and some of the grand crescents of the 1790s stood unfinished for years. Their end houses missing, like broken teeth. Many of the small craftsmen and investors who had bet their savings on Bathstone lost everything. The Golden City was, among other things, a bubble, and when it popped, it ruined real families. Then follow the money backward, because where did the fortunes renting these terraces come from? Some came from English land, some from trade, some from government office, and a substantial, documented stream came from slavery. Bath's own museums and archives, including research published by the Bath Preservation Trust and the National Trust, have detailed the connections in recent years. Families enriched by Caribbean sugar plantations, worked by enslaved Africans, wintered in Bath, bought houses in its finest streets, and in some cases funded its development. Visitors to the city included plantation owners traveling with enslaved servants, and newspapers of the era carried advertisements that make the reality impossible to deny. Even the circus and the Royal Crescent had residents whose income traced to the plantations. None of this was hidden at the time. It was ordinary, which is precisely the horror of it. The candlelit ballroom and the sugar field were two rooms of the same economic house. And Bath was where the profits came to dance. We should be precise here. As always, Bath was not built by enslaved labor, and not every fortune in the city was a plantation fortune. The stone was cut by Somerset quarrymen, the walls raised by English craftsmen, many of whom the crash of 1793 bankrupted. But the demand side of Bath's economy, the rents, the subscriptions, the gambling stakes, the doctors' fees, drew heavily on empire, and the empire's ugliest institution was stitched into the season's finances. When Jane Austen, in Mansfield Park, has a character's wealth depend on estates in Antigua, she was describing the economic weather of her world, and her first readers would not have needed a footnote. So hold both truths as this chapter closes, because both are real. The woods, father and son, built one of the most beautiful urban landscapes ever created, a city that UNESCO would one day inscribe as a World Heritage Site for precisely these Georgian streets. And that beauty was paid for by a society whose money was often cruel and whose confidence was often borrowed. Scenery, after all, is the art of showing an audience only what it came to see. In 1797, into this finished golden theatre, walked a visitor the scenery could not fool. She was 21 years old, a clergyman's daughter from Hampshire, already secretly funnier than almost anyone in England, and she was taking notes. Her name was Jane Austen. Chapter 8. Enter Miss Austen. Every famous city has an official portrait. And then, if it is unlucky, it meets a great writer. Bath was unlucky twice. It attracted the sharpest novelist in the history of the English language, and she did not entirely like it. Jane Austen was born in 1775 in the village of Steventon in Hampshire, about 50 miles from Bath. The seventh child of a country clergyman. Understand her world, because Bath only makes sense against it. The Austens were gentry by education and manners, but not by money. 8 children on a rector's income meant that the daughters faced the one problem that powers every novel Jane would ever write. A woman of her class could not earn, could not inherit much, and could not remain respectable outside a household. Marriage was not romance. Marriage was the entire economy of a woman's life, and the largest, busiest, most efficient marriage market in England was a golden stone city 50 miles down the road. Jane knew Bath long before she lived there. She visited in 1797, staying with relatives, and again in 1799, lodging near Queen Square. She was in her early 20s, and she came as a tourist comes, for a season of balls, shops, and gossip. Her surviving letters from these visits, preserved and published in scholarly editions of her correspondence, crackle with amusement. She reports on fabrics and bonnets, on crowded rooms, on the small absurdities of fashionable people, a young woman having fun, in other words, and taking notes. Because those visits produced something extraordinary. In the late 1790s, back home in Steventon, she drafted a novel about a naive young woman's first season in Bath. She called it Susan. The world would eventually know it as Northanger Abbey. and we will walk through it in the next chapter. Then, in the winter of 1800, the visit became a sentence. Her father, the Reverend George Austen, decided abruptly to retire, hand the parish to his eldest son, and move the family to Bath. Jane was 25, and she was not consulted. A family tradition, recorded by her relatives in later memoirs, holds that when the news was broken to her, Jane fainted. "We owe you our usual honesty here." That story comes from family recollection, written down long afterward, and scholars cannot verify it. What we can verify is her own pen. In a letter of January 1801, she wrote to her sister about the prospect with a dry, controlled irony, in phrasing so carefully cheerful that biographers have been reading the unhappiness underneath it for 2 centuries. With Jane Austen, you must always listen to what the politeness is covering. Why did she dread it? Look at the move through her eyes. Steventon meant countryside, a settled community, her father's library of some 500 books, and the private rhythm in which she had already drafted early versions of the novels that became Pride and Prejudice and Sense and Sensibility. Bath meant rented rooms in a rented life, a city of strangers performing at one another, and, hanging over it all, an unspoken purpose that everyone understood. 2 unmarried daughters, 25 and 27, were being brought to the marriage market. The machine that Beau Nash had built, the assemblies, the introductions, the public walks, was now pointed directly at her. The family settled first at number 4, Sydney Place, a good address across the river in the new district, facing the pleasure grounds of Sydney Gardens. You can stand in front of that house today. And the years that followed, from 1801 to 1806, are the strangest chapter in the biography of a genius, because the great engine simply stopped. In the years before Bath, Austen had drafted 3 novels. In the Bath years, as far as scholars can establish, she completed nothing. She began a novel called The Watsons, a dark story about daughters facing poverty, and abandoned it unfinished. Biographers have debated the silence ever since. Some point to unhappiness, some to the disruption of constant moves and lodgings, some to the simple fact that a woman in rented rooms, always in company, has no room of her own in which to write. We cannot read her mind, and we will not pretend to, but the pattern is stark. Take the sharpest observer in England, place her inside the most observable city in England, and the writing stops. Life in Bath did hand her material, some of it cruel. In December of 1802, on a visit back in Hampshire, a wealthy young family friend named Harris Big Wither proposed marriage. Jane accepted him in the evening, and withdrew her acceptance the next morning. He was heir to a large estate. Acceptance meant security for herself, her sister, her aging parents. Refusal meant continued genteel poverty. She refused anyway, and biographers agree, we know almost nothing certain about her reasons. Hold that decision in your mind when we read Persuasion, a novel about a woman who said no, and what it cost her. Then Bath showed the family its other face, the one under the golden stone. In January of 1805, her father died in their lodgings after a short illness. He was buried in Bath, at the church of St. Swithin, where he had married Jane's mother decades before, and with him died most of the family income, because his clergyman's pension was for his own life only. The Austen women, mother and 2 daughters, discovered what Bath was like when you were no longer a customer. Their addresses over the following months trace the descent for anyone who knows the city's map, from respectable Gay Street to lodgings in Trim Street. Each move a step down in rent and status, their income patched together from contributions sent by Jane's brothers. Bath was, And this is the coldest fact in this chapter. A city with no role for a poor gentlewoman, except to become invisible in it. In the summer of 1806, the Austen women finally left, moving towards Southampton and eventually to the Hampshire cottage at Chawton, where Jane's genius would roar back to life. Years later, in a letter of 1808, she looked back on the day they departed and wrote of her happy feelings of escape. 2 words, from her own hand, in her own correspondence. Escape. So here is the delicious problem this city has never quite solved. And it is the reason these 2 chapters exist. Bath's most valuable citizen. The writer, whose name now fills its shops and festivals and walking tours, lived here 5 years, wrote almost nothing here, buried her father here, slid toward poverty here, and recorded her departure as an escape. And yet, she set 2 of her 6 novels in this city. More than anywhere else, she reconstructed its streets, its rooms, its rituals with a precision no admirer has ever matched. Whatever Jane Austen felt about Bath, she could not stop looking at it. Dislike, it turns out, can be a form of attention. An attention, from her, was immortality. So let us now do what millions of her readers have dreamed of doing. Let us walk into her bath, with her books as the map. Chapter 9. Bath through Austen's eyes. 2 novels. 1 city. Written from the 2 ends of a life. Northanger Abbey is Bath in the morning, seen by a heroine of 17 who finds it dazzling. Persuasion is Bath in the evening, seen by a heroine of 27 who finds it tiresome. Read them together, and you are holding a double portrait. The city and the author, before and after. Both were published together in December of 1817, months after Austen's death, which means her first Bath novel and her last reached the world side by side. In one binding, let us take them in order and use them as they deserve to be used. As the best guidebook ever written, Northanger Abbey follows Catherine Morland, a country clergyman's daughter of 17, taken to Bath for the season by wealthy neighbours. Sound familiar? Austen was a country clergyman's daughter who first came to Bath at about that age. And while Catherine is not Jane, the itinerary is drawn from life. Catherine's Bath is a festival. She is dazzled by the crowds, and Austen counts off the stations of the season like a tour guide with a raised eyebrow. The morning gathering in the pump room, where the company parades while pretending to drink the waters. The evening balls, the theatre, the shops of Milsom Street, the smartest shopping street in the city, where one character famously agonizes over the purchase of a gown. Every one of those places was real, and nearly every one still stands. You can drink a glass of the warm mineral water in the pump room today, over the very spring the Romans sealed in lead. And thousands of Austen readers do exactly that every year. Most of them, it must be said, agree with the verdict Dickens will deliver on the taste in a later chapter, and the plot begins with a detail so accurate it is practically a documentary. Catherine, at a ball in the lower rooms, is introduced to a witty young clergyman named Henry Tilney, and the introduction is performed by the master of ceremonies. There it is, Beau Nash's system, still running like a clock some 60 years after his death, now operated by his successors. Everything we built in Chapter 6. The rules, the introductions, the choreography of strangers, appears in Austen's pages as ordinary life. The novel even lets us hear the machinery hum. Henry Tilney teases Catherine by rehearsing the standard Bath small talk, the scripted questions every new acquaintance asked. How long have you been in Bath? Have you been to the theatre? Are you fond of dancing? He recites the script while mocking the script. And in that one scene you can hear exactly what Austen thought of manufactured politeness. She could see the stage machinery, and she wanted her readers to see it too. But the sharpest thing in Northanger Abbey is not the satire of Bath. It is the satire of fiction itself. Catherine is addicted to Gothic novels, the horror bestsellers of the 1790s. All haunted castles and locked chambers, invited to the Tilney family's country house, the Abbey of the title. She convinces herself that a real Gothic crime must be hidden there, and humiliates herself hunting for it. The lesson she learns is pure Austen. The real dangers in her world are not murderers in castles. They are charming liars in ballrooms, and the polite cruelty of people pursuing money through marriage. Bath, the city of surfaces, was the perfect training ground for a heroine learning to read what is under a surface. Now cross the city, and the years, to persuasion. Austen wrote it in 1815 and 1816 at Chawton, a decade after her escape, when she was already ill with the condition that would kill her at 41. It is her last completed novel, her quietest, and many readers' favourite. Its heroine, Anne Elliot, is 27, unmarried, and carrying an old grief. 8 years earlier, she was engaged to a young naval officer, Frederick Wentworth, brilliant but poor, and she was persuaded by an older family friend to break the engagement as imprudent. Now Wentworth returns from the wars rich, a captain, still angry, and still unmarried. Remember the biography. Austen, at 27, in her Bath years, said no to a prudent marriage. Scholars rightly warn against reading novels as diaries, and we repeat that warning. But no reader has ever quite been able to separate Anne's second chance from the author who never got one. And where does fate corner Anne? Bath, Hervin, spendthrift, father, Sir Walter Elliot, has rented a grand house in Camden Place to keep up appearances he can no longer afford, which tells you Austen had learnt exactly what Bath addresses signal, because Camden Place is high, showy, and slightly precarious. Anne arrives dreading the city, and the novel gives her feelings that match, sentence for sentence, the mood of Jane Austen's own Bath years. The white glare of the streets, the noise of carts and carriages, the rain on crowded pavements. Persuasion is the anti-brochure. It is Bath, described by someone who sees the season as a performance she is too tired and too honest to join, which makes what happens next one of the great turns in English literature. In this city of performances, Austen stages the most emotionally naked scene she ever wrote. At the White Hart Inn, in a crowded room, Wentworth overhears Anne defending the constancy of women who love without hope. He cannot speak to her. So, in the middle of the company, he writes. The letter he slides toward her has been called the finest love letter in all of fiction, a declaration of half agony and half hope. And it was written by a dying woman about a second chance. And then Austen does something perfect. She sends the reunited lovers out of the crowded rooms, away from the parades, to walk together up a quiet path behind the terraces called the Gravel Walk, where at last they can speak freely. That path exists. It runs today exactly where it ran then, between the Royal Crescent and the town, and every year readers walk it slowly, some of them in tears, on the route where Anne Elliot got her life back. One more stop on this walk, because the guidebook has a final page most tourists miss. In Persuasion, Austen gives Anne a friend, Mrs. Smith, a widow who has lost her money and her health, living in cheap lodgings in Westgate buildings, unable even to afford the baths that might ease her pain. Sir Walter is horrified that his daughter would visit such an address. Read that subplot, knowing the biography, and it stops your breath. Westgate Buildings is a real street, in the low part of town, near the old baths. And a poor widow in cheap Bath lodgings is precisely what Jane Austen's own mother was in 1805, and precisely the fate that hung over Jane and her sister for the rest of their lives. The novelist put her own worst fear into the novel, at the exact address where it lived. Bath's finest chronicler knew the city's golden promise from above and its cold arithmetic from below, and she wrote both. Here, then, is the verdict of the double portrait, and it is the editorial heart of this whole story. Austen used Bath twice, and both times the city plays the same role. It is the world of surfaces that her heroines must learn to see through. Catherine learns it laughing. Anne learns it grieving. The golden stage that Nash and the Woods built, the stage designed to make everyone look better than they are, became, in the hands of a genius who distrusted it, the perfect instrument for revealing what people actually are. Bath gave English literature its great theatre of insincerity, and Austen repaid the city by making it immortal for exactly that. She never saw the repayment. Jane Austen died in July of 1817, in Winchester, with her Bath novels still in manuscript, and the city she escaped was already beginning a long fade of its own. Chapter 10. The Long Decline. Fashion is a tide, and tides do not announce their turning. Sometime in the first decades of the 1800s, while Bath was still building crescents and printing ballroom tickets, the fashionable world quietly stopped coming. To understand this city's next 100 years, you need to understand where everyone went. The answer is simple, and for Bath it was fatal. They went to the sea. The medical theories that had crowned Bath were shifting under it. Physicians of the new century increasingly prescribed sea bathing and sea air, and a generation of coastal resorts rose to sell the new cure. The greatest of them was Brighton, on the south coast, and Brighton had a weapon Bath could not match. The Prince Regent, the future King George IV, made it his personal playground, building his oriental fantasy palace, the Royal Pavilion, but by the sea, where royalty played. Fashion followed, exactly as it had once followed queens to Bath. Then, in the 1840s, the railways arrived and finished the job, because the train did to travel what the telephone would later do to letters. London society could now reach the coast in hours. Bath, whose entire business model was capturing the leisured class for a whole season, watched its customers become day trippers somewhere else. The numbers behind the glitter tell the story plainly. The city's census population barely grew through the middle of the 1800s. In a century when industrial cities like Manchester and Birmingham were exploding in size, Bath had no coal, no cotton, no heavy industry to catch the new wealth. The assembly rooms that had turned away crowds in 1790 struggled to fill their subscription lists, and the grand houses built as seasonal scenery found a new clientele, quieter and greyer than the old one. Retired officers on half pay, clergymen's widows, elderly gentlefolk of modest income, drawn by the one thing a faded resort offers in abundance: respectable addresses at falling rents. The city of the young and scandalous became, within a generation, a city of the old and careful. Contemporaries noticed and said so. Bath acquired the reputation it would carry for a century. A beautiful waiting room, literature, which had crowned Bath through Austen, now recorded the fade, and no witness was more devastating than a young reporter who knew the city personally. Charles Dickens visited Bath and set part of his first great success there. The Pickwick Papers, published in 1836 and 1837. His Bath chapters are a demolition by laughter. He shows us the pump room ritual still grinding on, and he settles the question of the famous waters through his character Sam Weller, who declares that they taste of warm flat irons. He populates the assemblies with preening masters of ceremonies and faded dowagers hunting card partners. Where Austen's Bath was a dangerous stage, Dickens's Bath is an open-air museum that does not know it has closed. The joke landed because it was recognizable. By the 1830s, the machinery Beau Nash built was still running. But the audience had left the theatre, and yet, here is the twist this chapter exists to deliver. And it is one of the great accidental mercies in the history of cities. Bath's failure saved Bath. Think about what happened to England's successful cities in the 1800s. Prosperity is a demolition crew. Booming Victorian cities tore down their Georgian streets to build bigger, taller, busier replacements. Railways through the middle. Warehouses on the squares. London lost enormous swaths of its Georgian fabric to its own success. Bath was spared that fate for the least romantic reason imaginable. Nobody wanted the land badly enough. There was no industrial boom demanding space. No commercial pressure worth the cost of demolition. The crescents and terraces survived the Victorian age, the way furniture survives in a house where no one moves anything. Through stillness, decline, which felt like death to the city's shopkeepers, was acting as a preservative. The golden stage was being kept intact, dusty but standing, for an audience that had not been born yet. The Springs, meanwhile, had one more Victorian surprise to deliver, and it returns us to the oldest thread in this story. In the late 1870s, a city engineer named Charles Davis, investigating a leak near the King's Bath, followed the hot water downward and found it running through Roman masonry. Through the 1880s, excavations uncovered what this film showed you in Chapter 2. The Great Bath itself, the lead-lined pool of Aquae Sulis, lost under the city for more than 1,000 years. The Victorians, who could not fill their own assembly rooms, suddenly possessed the finest Roman bathing complex in Northern Europe, and they did something very Victorian about it. They built viewing terraces above the ancient pool, opened the site to the paying public, and watched the visitors arrive. The city that had run out of fashionable customers began, almost by accident, to discover its next business. Bath could sell its past, hold the picture as the century turns, because it is stranger than it looks. A city of retired colonels and cautious widows, laughed at by novelists, bypassed by fashion, is quietly sitting on three assets whose value almost no one yet understands. An intact Georgian stage set, a freshly excavated Roman wonder, and the complete works of Jane Austen, whose reputation, through the late 1800s, was steadily climbing from beloved novelist toward national monument. Every piece of modern Bath's fortune was already in place by 1900. All the city had to do was survive the 20th century. That should have been easy. A small spa town with no industry, no port, and no strategic value ought to have slept through the world's catastrophes untouched. It did not. What came for Bath on 2 spring nights in 1942 was chosen from the pages of a tourist guidebook. Chapter 11. The Bath Blitz. We need to begin this chapter carefully, because it deals with the deaths of hundreds of civilians. And a story like that must be told with respect or not at all. The facts that follow come from the historical record, from the city's own memorials and archives, and from the work of local historians and the Bath Blitz Memorial Project, which has documented these 2 nights for decades. By the spring of 1942, Britain had been at war with Germany for more than 2 years. Bath had felt the war the way most provincial towns had. Through rationing, blackouts, evacuated children arriving from London, and thousands of Admiralty workers relocated into the city when naval departments moved out of the capital. What Bath had not felt was bombing at scale. The great raids of 1940 and 1941, The Blitz that Americans have heard of fell on London, on Coventry, on the ports and factory cities. Bath had no aircraft works, no docks, no significant war industry. Its people had reason to believe geography and insignificance would protect them, and official preparations reflected that confidence. Then, in late March of 1942, the British Royal Air Force bombed the historic German port city of Lübeck, a medieval town of timber buildings that burned terribly. Weeks later, British bombers struck the historic city of Rostock. The German leadership answered with a decision that still stands out. Even in that pitiless war, for its cold logic, they ordered a series of retaliatory raids against English cities, chosen not for military value, but for their cultural and historic importance. Targets selected, according to accounts widely reported from a German Foreign Office statement at the time, with the help of a tourist guidebook, the Baedeker Guide. The famous red-covered travel companion of pre-war Europe, gave these attacks the name History Remembers, the Baedeker Raids. Exeter was struck first. In the final days of April, Bath was second. Norwich and York followed within the week. And Canterbury, weeks later. Strip away the official language about cultural targets, and the meaning is stark. These cities were attacked, in large part, for being beautiful. For Bath, that is the dark mirror of its entire story. The quality that had always been the city's fortune had become, for 2 nights, the reason it appeared on a target list. The bombers came on the night of Saturday, April 25th, 1942, crossing the Channel from airfields in occupied France. Bath's defences were thin, and the raiders came in low. They dropped high explosives and incendiaries across the city. And then, hours later, in the early morning darkness, they returned to bomb the fires. Their first wave had started. The following night, Sunday into Monday, they came back again. Survivors interviewed over the years by local historians described machine gun fire in the streets during the raids, and the sound of aircraft diving low over the rooftops. Over those 2 nights, more than 400 people were killed in Bath. More than 1,000 buildings were destroyed or seriously damaged. The dead included families sheltering in their homes, air raid wardens on duty, children. Many of the victims were buried in a communal grave at Haycombe Cemetery on the edge of the city, where the memorial to them stands today. The city's fabric took wounds that are still legible. The assembly rooms, the very ballrooms where Catherine Morland danced in Austen's pages, were gutted by incendiaries. Barely 4 years after a careful restoration had reopened them in 1938, houses in the Royal Crescent were hit, and part of the circus was damaged when a bomb fell among the houses. The Francis Hotel on Queen Square lost much of its frontage. Whole streets of humbler Georgian housing, the modest terraces where the city's working people lived, were simply erased. And it is worth pausing on that, because memory can be unjust. The famous monuments were damaged and are remembered. The ordinary streets were destroyed and are mostly forgotten, along with the fact that most of the dead came from them. And here, briefly, this story touches another film in this series. 3 years after these raids, the wartime logic of choosing cities from maps reached its terrible conclusion at Hiroshima. Bath's 2 nights were a small event by the measure of that war, and this city would be the first to say so. But the kinship is real, and it is worth 1 sentence. In both cities, somewhere in an office, a place's own qualities were written into a list, and the list became a reason to burn it. Bath buried its dead, cleared its rubble, and did what this city has always done between catastrophes. It endured, and it kept the stage standing. The assembly rooms were rebuilt after the war and reopened once more. The damaged houses of the circus and the crescent were repaired. their scars pointed out today by tour guides to visitors who would otherwise never guess. On the 50th anniversary, in 1992, the city dedicated memorials to the victims, and the Bath Blitz Memorial Project continues to record the names and stories of the dead, so that the count is not just a number. The Luftwaffe had given Bath its worst 2 nights since the legions left. Here is the sentence nobody in 1945 would have believed. The gravest damage to Georgian Bath in the 20th century was still to come, and it would arrive not by bomber, but by committee. Chapter 12. Saving Bath. Here is a claim that sounds impossible, and the people who make it were there. Many preservationists, surveying the city in the 1970s, argued that post-war planning and redevelopment had destroyed more of Bath's historic fabric than the German raids themselves. This chapter is about how that happened, how it was stopped, and how the fight over this one small city helped change the way the world thinks about old buildings. Begin with sympathy for the demolishers, because history owes fairness even to people it judges. The Bath of 1950 was not a museum. It was a tired, damp, war-scarred town where thousands of families lived in Georgian buildings with no proper heating, failing roofs, and outdoor plumbing. The golden stone was black. Decades of coal smoke had coated the crescents in soot so thick that many residents genuinely did not know their city was golden underneath. To a post-war planner, armed with modern ideas and a bomb-damaged map, much of Bath looked less like heritage and more like a slum with columns. Britain in those years was rebuilding itself in concrete, and the future was understood to look like motorways, tower blocks, and shopping precincts. Bath's council, like councils across the country, drew up plans to modernize. What followed, through the 1950s, and especially the 1960s and early 1970s, is remembered in preservation circles by a blunt name: the Sack of Bath. The phrase comes from the title of a book published in 1973 by the writer Adam Ferguson, a furious, illustrated indictment of what the bulldozers were doing, and the book gave the scandal a national audience. The pattern Ferguson documented was consistent. The famous set pieces, the Royal Crescent, the circus, the Abbey, were never threatened. What fell, street by street, were the supporting players, the modest Georgian terraces and artisan houses that made up the connective tissue of the city, the homes of the chairmen and dressmakers and footmen of the Georgian age. Estimates cited in the preservation literature put the losses in the range of 1,000 or more historic buildings, and Ferguson's book argued that what replaced them was unworthy of what was lost. Isolated masterpieces left standing in a rising tide of mediocrity. And then the tide turned. And it turned because people fought. Residents and conservationists organized. And the Bath Preservation Trust, founded back in 1934, moved to the center of a national argument. Journalists took sides. Ferguson's book landed in 1973 like a grenade in a committee room, and questions about Bath were raised in Parliament. The timing mattered, because Britain as a whole was souring on the concrete future. The demolition of beloved landmarks in London in the early 60s had already radicalized a generation of architectural writers, and European Architectural Heritage Year in 1975 gave the preservationists a continental stage. Bath became the test case, the place where the question was asked, in its sharpest form: does a city belong to its planners, or to its past and its future? The preservationists won, and the victory reshaped the city's law and its economy. Demolitions were halted. Conservation area protections were extended across the historic center, and the cleaning began through the 70s and 80s. Building after building was washed and repaired, and Bath watched itself turn from black back to gold, street by street, like a photograph developing. Then came the coronation. In 1987, the United Nations Cultural Agency UNESCO inscribed the city of Bath, the entire city, on its World Heritage List, placing these streets in the same register as the pyramids of Egypt and the center of Rome. Only a handful of cities on Earth have ever been listed whole. The citation recognized precisely the double inheritance this film has traced: the Roman remains and the Georgian city. Two golden ages stacked on one spring. Step back and look at what the 20th century had done to Bath. Because the shape of it is almost too neat. The city was bombed for its beauty, then mutilated by its own modernizers, then saved by its citizens, then crowned by the world. And the crown came with a living to be earned. Heritage, the preservationists had argued, was not a burden but an asset. And Bath was about to prove them right, on a scale nobody predicted. Because while the conservationists were washing the stone, something else was happening in bookshops and living rooms across the Atlantic. Jane Austen, dead since 1817, was about to become one of the most bankable names in global entertainment. And the city she escaped was holding the keys to her world. Chapter 13. The Austen Industry. Every economy Bath has ever had was built on a promise. The Romans sold healing. The Georgians sold status. Modern Bath sells something subtler. And if you have ever watched a costume drama on a Sunday evening, you have felt its pull. Bath sells time travel. The turning point can be dated with unusual precision. In September of 1995, British television broadcast a 6-part adaptation of Pride and Prejudice, and its success, first in Britain and then in the United States, set off a wave that the press, at the time, openly called Austen Mania. The following year brought film adaptations of Emma and Sense and Sensibility to global audiences, the latter winning an Academy Award for Emma Thompson's screenplay. Persuasion was filmed in that same wave, with scenes shot in Bath itself. Austen's 6 novels, which had never gone out of print, now had something new behind them, the full engine of the modern screen industry. And every adaptation functioned as an unpaid advertisement for one particular city. Producers needed intact Georgian streetscapes, and thanks to the preservation battles of the last chapter, England had exactly one city that could play the part at full scale. Bath understood its role quickly. The Jane Austen Centre opened on Gay Street in 1999, a few doors from a house where the Austens themselves had lodged. The annual Jane Austen Festival began in 2001 and grew into an event drawing thousands of costumed visitors from around the world. Its Grand Regency Promenade, filling the streets each September with bonnets and redcoats. And the demographics of this pilgrimage are the quiet punchline of our whole story. Because the largest contingents of overseas festival visitors reported by organizers over the years have consistently come from the United States. Think about that. American readers, citizens of the Republic whose founding documents were shaped partly by the revolution we watched begin near these springs, now cross the Atlantic to dress for a season in the city Austen fled. What she would have written about it to her sister, we can only guess, and honesty makes us leave it there. Then the wave went global again. In December of 2020, the streaming series Bridgerton arrived, a Regency fantasy filmed extensively in Bath, with the Royal Crescent standing in for fashionable London. The series became one of the most watched programs in its platform's history, and Bath's tourism authorities reported surges of visitors coming specifically to find its locations. The city now appears on screen so regularly, in adaptations of Persuasion and Northanger Abbey, in Bridgerton and its successors, that it has become what the Georgian builders always intended it to be. A permanent stage set. Except, the audience is now measured in hundreds of millions. Tourism studies in recent years, published in reports by the local council and tourism bodies, have put annual visitor numbers in the millions and the value of the visitor economy in the hundreds of millions of pounds, supporting roughly 1 job in 10 in the city. The marriage market is gone. The market for imagining it has never been richer. But our rule in this series is that every golden age gets its ledger opened. And modern Bath is no exception. Ask the people who actually live here, and many will tell you the performance has a price. House prices in Bath rank among the highest in Britain outside London, a fact tracked year after year in national property surveys, which means the teachers, nurses, and hospitality workers who keep the city running increasingly cannot afford to live in it. Residents' groups and the local council have publicly debated the spread of short-term holiday lets, which convert homes into tourist lodgings, and the strain that millions of annual visitors place on a city of fewer than 100,000 people. Stand on a summer Saturday in the crowded courtyard by the Abbey, and you can watch the question this whole film has been asking turn uncomfortable. When a city becomes a stage this successful, where do the stagehands sleep? Bath, in the 2020s, is wrestling with the oldest cost of its oldest business. And it is worth saying plainly that the wrestling is real, documented, and unresolved. A city that sells the past still has to be a home in the present. And those two jobs are pulling against each other harder than at any time in Bath's history. And the year 2025 brought the celebration to a peak regardless, because it marked 250 years since Jane Austen's birth in December of 1775. Bath, along with institutions across Britain, mounted a year of exhibitions, biles, and festival events for the anniversary, and the woman who wrote of her happy feelings of escape was toasted in the rebuilt assembly rooms as the city's greatest daughter. Cities, like people, curate their memories. The deepest closing of the circle in modern Bath, though, is not literary, it is liquid. For decades in the late 20th century, after health concerns ended, the old spa, bathing in the 1970s, the hot springs flowed through a city where no one could bathe, a miracle running unused for the first sustained period since the legions left. Then, in 2006, after years of construction, the Thermae Bath Spa opened in the city centre, a modern complex of glass and bath stone drawing on the same thermal waters, with a rooftop pool looking across the chimneys to the hills. Stand in that warm water at dusk, as thousands of visitors now do every week, and you are doing precisely what the Celts did, what the Romans did, what queens and gamblers and invalids did. The technology around the water has changed every few centuries. The instinct in the water has not changed at all. And one more thing has not changed. Go to the Roman baths today and watch the visitors at the edge of the ancient green pool. Watch long enough and you will see it happen. A hand goes into a pocket, and a coin arcs into the water, following 2,000 years of coins, down into the spring, past the offerings Barry Cunliffe's team catalogued, down toward the pieces of Iron Age money we met in Chapter 1. The museum staff periodically retrieve the modern coins and donate them to charity. So the old promise still works. In its way, the water still takes the coin and gives back help. Nobody instructs the visitors to do this. Nobody needs to. 20 centuries of religions and fashions and sciences have come and gone above this pool, and the human hand still does exactly what it did when the goddess was called Sulis. Some instincts are older than every story told about them. So, the inventory of 2026 reads like the whole story in miniature. The Roman baths, among the most visited heritage attractions in Britain, with the head of Sulis Minerva gazing at her millionth camera. The Crescent and the Circus, scrubbed gold, playing themselves on screens worldwide. The festival bonnets on Milsom Street each September. The steam rising off the rooftop pool. The coins, still falling. Every age of Bath is open for business simultaneously. All of it runs on the two assets this film began with. One spring that never stopped, and one writer who never stopped looking. Chapter 14. What Bath asks of us. Go back to where we started. Early morning. The Roman baths. Before the doors open, steam lifts off the green water into the cold air. Exactly as it did yesterday. Exactly as it will tomorrow. The water rising past your feet may have fallen as rain before a single stone of this city existed. It has outlasted the goddess, the legions, the monks, the physicians, the gamblers, the planners, and the bombers. It will outlast the tourists. It will outlast this film. Every city in this series taught us something different. Paris taught us how a city absorbs catastrophe and turns it into identity. Boston taught us how a city argues with its own founding ideals. Hiroshima taught us how a city carries a memory on behalf of the whole world. Bath's lesson is quieter, and it may be the most useful of all. Bath teaches how a city survives by performing, and what that performance costs and buys, because look at what this story has actually shown you. Bath has never, in 2,000 years, primarily made things. It has made impressions. The temple was staged to awe Britons. The Georgian city was staged to flatter its guests. The modern city is staged to transport its visitors 2 centuries backward in an afternoon. Every economy Bath has ever had was, at bottom, theatre, and the city has been rebuilt, again and again, by whoever held the best script. A goddess, a church, a gambler in a white hat, a committee of preservationists, a streaming service. The stage stayed. The show changed. It would be easy to sneer at that. And some visitors do. A city of surfaces, a national costume party, a place where even the honesty of decay was scrubbed off and gilded. But the sneer misses what the performance protects. Because of it, the curse tablets survive, and you can read the actual handwriting of a Roman bather who lost his gloves. Because of it, the gravel walk survives, and you can trace the exact steps of the most quietly devastating reconciliation in English fiction. Because of it, 400 names from 2 nights in 1942 are remembered on a hillside, in a city that had every commercial reason to talk only of pleasant things. Performance, sustained long enough and cared for honestly enough, becomes preservation. The mask, worn for 2,000 years, turns out to have kept the face alive, and the price of the mask is real too. And Bath is paying it right now, in rents and crowds and the slow squeeze on the people behind the scenery. The show has never been free. Not for the Georgian craftsmen ruined in the crash. Not for the residents priced out today. That honesty belongs in the story, because Bath itself, at its best, has learned to tell it, and Jane Austen, who saw through this city more clearly than anyone before or since, would be entitled to the last irony. She distrusted Bath because it was a machine for appearances, a place where surfaces were traded as substance. She was right, and her novels prove she was right. Yet it is precisely the machine she distrusted that now guards her memory, funds the scholarship, restores the rooms she danced in, and carries her name to readers in languages she never heard of. The city of appearances became the keeper of the truest social record we have of its age. History does not often write jokes that good. So what does Bath ask of us? Stand by the water, and the question comes on the steam. Every person who ever entered this pool came believing, in some form. The oldest promise this valley ever made. The water can fix you. The Briton with her coin. The Roman with his aching joints. The childless queen. The anxious young lady at her first ball. The tired traveller in the rooftop pool last night. None of them were entirely wrong. And none were entirely right. Because what the water actually offers has never been a cure. It is a pause. A warm interval in a cold world. In which a person can stop. Soak. And imagine becoming someone slightly better than the person they were at home. Beau Nash sold that. The Romans sold that. The novelists anatomized it. And the film crews light it, somewhere above the pool this morning. A coin is already falling. The show goes on. The water was always the star.